The sun was shining brightly over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with neat houses, each with well-kept lawns, colorful flowers, and driveways that spoke of pride and routine. Birds chirped lazily from the trees, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers could be heard in the distance. It was one of those rare days that begged for slow enjoyment, a day when time itself seemed to stretch just enough for a few hours of calm. In one of these houses, a black woman in her late 30s had decided to take advantage of the perfect weather. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. Her schedule was always full. Between her work, her exercise routines, and her passion for motorcycles, free time was a treasure. She had built a life that was full and active, but even the most disciplined person needed a moment to pause. Today, that moment was by her own backyard pool. The pool was modest but inviting, sparkling under the sun's golden rays. The water reflected the sky like glass, and the gentle ripple from a small fountain in the corner added a soothing sound, a soft background to a day meant for peace. She had laid out her favorite sun lounger, placed a towel just so, and carefully set a book within reach. A cold drink sat on the small side table, condensation sliding down the glass. For her, these simple things were a luxury, a way to recharge and feel grounded in a world that often demanded so much. She stepped out onto the pool deck in a swimsuit that was simple but elegant, reflecting her confidence and comfort in her own skin. Her skin glistened slightly under the sun, and her hair, pulled back neatly, framed her strong, determined face. She had always carried herself with dignity, the kind of presence that made people take notice without needing to say a word. Yet today she had no intention of impressing anyone. This day was for her. She dipped her toes in the water and let out a soft sigh of relief. The warmth of the sun on her skin combined with the coolness of the water to create the perfect balance. She reclined on the lounger, letting her mind drift. She thought about the ride she had taken earlier in the week on her motorcycle, the way the wind had cut across her face, the freedom that came with being on the open road. Riding had always been a part of who she was. It gave her a sense of control and liberation that was hard to find anywhere else. It was also a reminder of how disciplined she had to be, how precise and alert, both on the road and in life. As she closed her eyes for a moment, she heard a faint sound coming from the other side of the fence. It was the neighbor's voice, sharp and suspicious, carrying over in a tone that immediately made her wary. She opened her eyes and noticed movement at the edge of the property line. A woman, middle-aged, peered over the fence. Her eyes narrowed and she muttered something under her breath, clearly reacting to the sight of her in the pool. The woman by the pool didn't panic. She had dealt with scrutiny before. It came with being a black woman living in spaces that weren't always welcoming, even in neighborhoods like this one. Still, she couldn't ignore the hostility in the neighbor's expression. Something about the way she was being watched felt intrusive, judgmental. It was the kind of gaze that carried assumptions. The kind that looked at a black woman and immediately questioned her place, her behavior, her right to exist in that space. She tried to focus on her relaxation, to tell herself it was not worth her energy. But the feeling of being observed lingered, a tension that made the sun seem hotter and the water cooler than it should have felt. The neighbor seemed agitated, moving closer to the fence, peering over again as if trying to get a better look. She wasn't just curious. She was suspicious, almost as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The woman in the pool shook her head slightly and tried to dismiss it. She had encountered this before. Microaggressions that were small but constant, subtle but sharp. She knew the types, the quick judgments, the assumptions based on appearance, the stories people created in their minds without asking a single question. She had learned to carry herself with calm, to keep her composure even when others acted out of ignorance or fear. Still, it was frustrating. She had worked hard to create her life, to earn her independence, to enjoy the fruits of her labor. She had a career that demanded respect and a lifestyle that reflected her dedication to discipline and health. And here she was, simply enjoying a sunny afternoon in her own backyard, being scrutinized as if she were a trespasser. The neighbor made a sudden movement and pulled out her phone. The woman by the pool noticed the glint of the screen, the way the neighbor's fingers hovered over it, poised to act. Her heart sank slightly, though she tried not to show it. She knew what might come next. She had seen it happen to others, calls made out of suspicion, assumptions escalating into unnecessary confrontations. She hoped it wouldn't go that far, but her instincts, honed through years of training and experience, told her to prepare. She carefully stood, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no panic, just a calm readiness. Her body carried the confidence of someone who had faced far more challenging situations than a suspicious neighbor. Her mind ran through possible scenarios, thinking about how to handle the situation with minimal conflict. She didn't want to escalate, didn't want to make things worse. But she also knew she had every right to be there. From her experience in law enforcement, she had learned the importance of controlling the situation without losing composure. She had trained herself to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats without overreacting, and to assert her authority when necessary. Today was different. There was no criminal element, no immediate danger, but the principles applied the same way. Confidence, presence, and clarity could prevent unnecessary trouble. The neighbor's agitation grew more obvious. She waved her phone, muttering something angrily, clearly trying to convey her displeasure to someone on the other end. The woman by the pool narrowed her eyes slightly, watching carefully, not out of fear but out of awareness. She understood the tension building, the potential for an interaction she hadn't asked for but would have to navigate. She decided to take a deep breath and focus on what she could control. The water beneath her, the sun on her skin, the tranquility of her own home, those were hers. No one could take that from her. She had fought hard for her independence, for her rights, for her ability to exist freely in spaces that weren't always welcoming. And she wasn't about to let someone else's ignorance rob her of a moment of peace. She moved slowly to the edge of the pool, standing tall. Her posture spoke of confidence, of a person who belonged. She didn't shout, didn't confront, just made her presence known. The neighbor, startled by the sudden movement, froze momentarily. The glimmer of recognition, the realization that she wasn't dealing with someone timid or intimidated, flickered across her face. The woman in the pool didn't wave or smile. She simply stood, calm and assured, a silent statement that she was not a threat, that she was in her own space, and that she deserved to be there. She returned her attention to the poolside furniture, the book she had placed carefully, the drink she had set to the side. This was hers, and she wasn't going to be rushed or intimidated. As she adjusted her towel and settled her book, she caught the neighbor still observing her from the fence. There was tension in the air, a subtle but palpable energy that made it clear something might happen. She could feel it, the instinctive warning that told her to be ready, and yet she remained calm, grounded in the knowledge that she had faced far greater challenges and emerged stronger each time. In that moment, the sun, the water, the quiet hum of the neighborhood, and the woman's steady breathing combined to create a fragile but resilient bubble of peace. She wasn't going to let it shatter without reason. Whatever came next, she was prepared to handle it, not with anger or aggression, but with control, dignity, and presence. The day had started as a simple escape, a few hours to relax and enjoy the sun, but it was shaping up to be something more. It was becoming a test, a reminder that even in the most ordinary settings, assumptions and biases could intrude. And she knew that how she responded would not only protect her peace but also reflect who she was, a woman disciplined, confident, and unafraid to stand her ground. As the neighbor's movements became more erratic, the woman in the pool took another deep breath. She reminded herself that she had every right to be there, that her life, her property, and her choices were hers alone. She would not be rushed, intimidated, or made to feel smaller than she was. This was her space, her sanctuary, and she was determined to protect it not with force, but with calm, unwavering presence. And so, as the sun beat down and the pool water shimmered in the afternoon light, she continued to enjoy her moment. But now there was a quiet awareness, a readiness for whatever might come next. She would not let ignorance or prejudice define her day. She would not let assumptions take away her peace. She was calm, she was prepared, and she was unapologetically herself. The scene was set, the tension palpable, and the first steps toward what could become a confrontation were quietly unfolding. But one thing was certain. This woman would meet whatever came with the same confidence and strength that had carried her through life so far. And in that confidence, she found not just safety but the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone else question it. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken by the distant wail of a siren. It was faint at first, almost easy to ignore, but gradually it grew louder, cutting through the soft afternoon sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The woman by the pool paused, her instincts alert. She knew what that sound meant even before the police cars came into view. Her heart didn't race, but a low tension settled in her chest. She had been trained to assess situations quickly, to read the room, or in this case, the backyard. From the corner of her eye, she noticed her neighbor moving hurriedly back from the fence, waving her arms and muttering to herself. It was clear the woman had called for help, and now the moment of confrontation she had anticipated was approaching. The woman in the pool kept her movements calm, slow, and deliberate. She didn't want to escalate anything, but she also wasn't going to shrink or hide. This was her home, and she had every right to be there. The police car pulled slowly into the street, and 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting lightly on their belts as they scanned the area. They were cautious, polite, but cautious. It was standard procedure for them to approach any report with care, but the tension in their shoulders and the way their eyes darted around showed that they were ready for anything. She could feel their presence without turning her head. She had spent years reading people, and she could tell immediately that they were unsure what they were walking into. The neighbor, finally realizing she wasn't just observing from a distance, rushed over to speak with the officers. Her voice was high-pitched and frantic as she explained the situation. She gestured toward the pool, describing the woman she had seen, her tone laced with suspicion. The woman by the pool listened quietly, her expression neutral but aware. She didn't interrupt. She let the neighbor speak, knowing that this was part of the unfolding scenario. The officers approached the pool, their pace measured, their eyes scanning the yard. The woman remained standing, her posture straight, her gaze calm. She raised a hand slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Hello," she said clearly, her voice steady. "I live here. Is there a problem?" The officers paused, clearly caught off guard by the calm authority in her voice. One of them stepped closer, still cautious but now curious. "Ma'am," he began politely, "we received a call about someone in the pool. Are you okay?" She nodded, maintaining eye contact, her tone even. "I'm perfectly fine. This is my property, my pool. I'm just enjoying the afternoon." She didn't add any anger or resentment. She didn't need to. Her presence, her posture, and the calm in her voice were enough to assert her authority in the situation. The officers exchanged glances. They had responded to many calls, but this was different. There was no threat, no aggressive behavior, nothing that required force. Just a woman standing confidently in her own backyard, doing exactly what she had every right to do. One officer lowered his hand slightly from his belt, his shoulders relaxing as he processed the scene. The neighbor, however, was not yet calm. She continued to mutter, glancing between the officers and the woman in the pool, her frustration clear. She couldn't believe what she had assumed. Her assumptions, made in a moment of suspicion, were unraveling in real time. She looked embarrassed but stubborn, unwilling to fully admit her mistake just yet. The woman in the pool, sensing the neighbor's lingering tension, decided to make things clear without confrontation. She reached for her wallet calmly and pulled out her police identification, holding it up for the officers to see. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight. Years of service, discipline, and experience were reflected in the ID. It was a quiet statement of authority and credibility. The officers took a step closer, examining the ID. Recognition flickered in their eyes. They had assumed a potential threat based on the call, but the reality was very different. The woman before them was not only harmless, but she was trained to handle difficult situations, trained to stay calm and assess threats. Their stance softened, the tension in their shoulders easing. The neighbor, finally realizing the truth, froze. Her eyes widened as she took in the revelation. She had called for help, assuming danger where there was none, and now, standing before her, was a woman who could have handled any situation with far more skill and authority than she could ever imagine. The embarrassment was visible, even if unspoken. She glanced away, muttering under her breath, clearly unsure how to recover from the mistake. The woman in the pool took a small step forward, her voice steady but gentle. "I understand that you were concerned," she said to the officers. And then, without looking directly at the neighbor, she added, "I'm just asking everyone to respect boundaries and assumptions before acting." Her words were calm, firm, and clear. There was no aggression, no bitterness, only a quiet insistence on fairness and awareness. The officers nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They had been trained to handle uncertainty, but they also recognized the weight of experience and authority in the woman's demeanor. It was clear that she could handle herself, and that any escalation was unnecessary. One officer spoke up, directing a polite comment toward the neighbor, reminding her of the importance of verifying situations before calling. It was tactful but firm, an indirect lesson in humility and awareness. The tension in the yard slowly began to ease, but not completely. The neighbor remained awkward, caught between embarrassment and defensiveness. She looked at the woman in the pool, who simply adjusted her towel and returned to her lounger, a clear signal that she would not engage further in unnecessary conflict. Her calmness was a lesson in itself. She didn't need to argue, explain extensively, or assert dominance. Her presence and demeanor spoke for themselves. The officers lingered for a moment, making sure there was no further concern, and then returned to their car. The siren faded into the distance, leaving the neighborhood quiet once again. The neighbor retreated back to her house, still muttering, still processing the embarrassment and the lesson she had just received. The woman in the pool, now alone again, felt a mix of relief and lingering frustration. It was exhausting in a subtle way to navigate spaces where assumptions and biases were so easily triggered. She sank back into the lounger, closing her eyes briefly. The sun was still warm on her skin, and the water still rippled gently in the pool. She focused on her breathing, on the calm, on the small pleasures she had created for herself. The incident was over, but its echo remained, a reminder of the challenges that came with simply existing as a black woman in spaces that weren't always welcoming. Yet, she also felt a quiet satisfaction. She had handled the situation with dignity, with calm, and with authority. She had not lost her composure, had not reacted with anger, had not allowed the assumptions of others to dictate her behavior. It was a small victory, but meaningful. It reinforced her sense of self, her understanding of her own worth, and her ability to navigate unexpected challenges without compromise. She thought briefly about the neighbor, about the assumptions and biases that had led to the call. It was frustrating, yes, but also predictable. People often reacted from fear or ignorance, projecting assumptions onto situations without evidence. She had seen it before, experienced it before, and she knew she would see it again. But today she had asserted her presence, her right, and her dignity in a way that left no question. The sun continued to beat down, warm and unrelenting, but the water offered its cool relief. She dipped her fingers into the pool, watching the gentle ripple expand across the surface. For a moment she allowed herself to simply enjoy the quiet, the sun, and the water. The interruption had passed, the tension had eased, and the day was hers once more. In her mind she reflected on the lessons of the afternoon. The world was full of assumptions, but she had the power to control how she responded. She had the power to maintain her peace, to assert her presence, and to remind others, quietly but firmly, of her rights and her dignity. The experience was a reminder that strength came not from aggression, but from calm awareness and self-assuredness. As she lay back, allowing herself to soak in the sun once again, she felt a sense of calm satisfaction. She had faced scrutiny, suspicion, and unnecessary attention, and had navigated it with grace and authority. The day had offered a challenge, a test of composure, and she had passed. The peace of the pool, the warmth of the sun, and the simple joy of being in her own space were hers to enjoy, uninterrupted. For now, the world outside her fence could continue to make assumptions, to judge quickly, and to call for help at the slightest provocation, but she would remain steady, grounded, and aware. She had faced far greater challenges both in her career and in life, and she knew that a moment like this, though frustrating, was something she could handle without losing herself. The afternoon stretched on, the sun moving slowly across the sky. The woman in the pool continued to enjoy the simple pleasure of water and warmth, feeling the satisfaction of knowing she had faced an unnecessary challenge and maintained her dignity. The neighborhood resumed its quiet rhythm, unaware of the small drama that had played out, and yet she carried the quiet triumph within her. She was calm, she was prepared, and she was Uli herself. After the police left, the woman stayed by the pool for a few moments, just letting the quiet return to her backyard. The gentle ripple of the water, the warmth of the sun, and the soft hum of the neighborhood filled the space around her. It should have felt peaceful, and in many ways it did, but a small tension lingered. She had handled the situation with calm and authority, yet the experience left a faint shadow, a reminder of how easily assumptions were made about her simply because of the color of her skin and her presence in a space others might not expect her to occupy. She sank back into her lounger, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm her face. Her mind drifted to her years in law enforcement, the challenges she had faced and the countless situations where she had had to stay calm under pressure. The training she had gone through, the situations she had navigated, all prepared her for this, even if it was much smaller in scale. Each experience had taught her that confidence and clarity could diffuse tension more effectively than force. Today had been a lesson in patience, awareness, and the quiet power of presence. Her thoughts shifted to the neighbor. She knew the woman was embarrassed, frustrated, and probably unsure how to face her now. The neighbor had acted out of fear and assumption, but she had done so without fully understanding the consequences of her actions. The woman by the pool had seen this pattern before, not just from strangers but from people who lived close, who watched quietly and judged quickly. It was the kind of subtle, everyday bias that could feel exhausting over time, yet she didn't hold anger in her heart. She knew that anger rarely solved anything, and her approach had always been to meet ignorance with calm, firmness, and an unshakable sense of self. She remembered a time early in her career when she had responded to a call that sounded much more dangerous than it actually was. The situation had been tense, emotions high, and people around had jumped to conclusions. She had stayed calm, assessed the scene, and handled the situation efficiently, avoiding unnecessary conflict. That memory came back to her now, reinforcing her belief in the power of measured responses. Today had been a smaller-scale version, but the principle remained the same. Calm, awareness, and confidence could turn a potentially tense situation into one of understanding. After a few minutes, she decided to step out of the pool. She wanted to regain control of the space fully, not just in body but in mindset. She wrapped a towel around herself and walked toward the patio, her steps slow and deliberate. She noticed the neighbor peeking from behind her curtain, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and shame. The woman didn't react to the gaze. She understood it was human nature to observe, to try to make sense of situations that challenged one's assumptions. She had faced it countless times and had learned that it was best to maintain composure and focus on what she could control: herself, her home, and her peace of mind. As she sat down with her drink, she reflected on the importance of visibility and representation. Being seen for who she truly was rather than the assumptions others made about her had always been a subtle challenge in her life. It was not about proving herself to anyone, but about existing authentically in a world where perception often distorted reality. Each time she navigated these spaces with confidence and dignity, she reinforced her own presence and reminded those around her that she belonged, no matter what assumptions they carried. She looked at the pool, the clear water shimmering in the sunlight, and smiled faintly. This was more than just a moment of relaxation. It was a statement, a reclaiming of space and agency. The sun and water, the simple joys of an ordinary day, had become symbols of resilience. She had enjoyed the freedom to relax, and she had asserted her right to do so without confrontation. The calm after the tension was more than peace, it was affirmation. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and noticed a message from a friend asking if she was okay. She typed back quickly, assuring them that she was fine and explaining briefly that there had been a misunderstanding in the neighborhood. She didn't go into detail. It wasn't necessary. Those who knew her understood her strength and composure, and she didn't need to justify herself to anyone else. She put the phone down and returned to the sensation of the sun on her skin, allowing herself to be fully present again. The neighbor eventually stepped outside, cautiously approaching the edge of the property. She didn't come too close, but it was clear she wanted some form of acknowledgement, perhaps a quiet reconciliation. The woman in the pool regarded her calmly, offering a simple nod and a polite smile. It was not a gesture of approval for the earlier call, but of recognition that fear and misunderstanding often drove people to act impulsively. Sometimes a calm response and quiet dignity spoke louder than confrontation ever could. The neighbor hesitated, then muttered a soft apology. It was awkward, stilted, and genuine in its own way. The woman by the pool acknowledged it with a nod, accepting the gesture without comment. She didn't need to scold or lecture. Her calm and self-assured demeanor had already communicated the lesson. Assumptions based on fear or appearance could lead to unnecessary conflict, and those who acted impulsively might benefit from reflection rather than confrontation. She returned to her lounger, adjusting the towel and picking up her book. The neighbor retreated back into her home, leaving the yard quiet once again. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The situation had been handled, the tension dissipated, and she had maintained control without raising her voice or losing her composure. This was her strength, cultivated over years of experience, training, and self-awareness. She had faced countless challenges in life, and this was simply another instance where calm, observation, and measured action turned a potentially uncomfortable encounter into a manageable one. As the afternoon progressed, she reflected on the larger implications of what had just happened. It was not just about one neighbor's assumptions. It was about the small, everyday ways that bias and quick judgments could shape interactions. It was about the importance of presence, confidence, and self-assuredness. It was about existing authentically and asserting one's right to do so without apology. These were lessons she had internalized long ago, lessons that allowed her to navigate life's challenges with grace and strength. She considered the broader community, the other neighbors who might have witnessed the exchange from a distance. Some might have felt sympathy, others curiosity, and a few might have recognized the lesson in quiet observation. She didn't know, and she didn't need to. Her concern was not to change everyone's perspective, but to maintain her own peace and dignity. The presence of others and their assumptions were outside her control. Her response, her composure, and her self-assuredness were entirely within it. The sun began to dip slightly toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard and changing the quality of the light. The warmth softened, the air cooling gently as evening approached. She took a slow breath, appreciating the beauty of the moment. Despite the earlier tension, the day had unfolded in a way that allowed her to affirm her presence, her rights, and her dignity. The challenge had been brief but meaningful, a reminder of the subtle ways society imposed scrutiny and judgment. She had met it not with anger but with calm and authority. She decided to take a moment to reflect on her life and achievements. Her career in law enforcement had been demanding, often dangerous, and required constant vigilance and discipline. Her love of motorcycles, her dedication to health and fitness, and her commitment to personal growth had shaped her into a strong, resilient woman. These qualities were not just practical tools. They were the foundation of her ability to navigate difficult social situations. Today had been a small test, but it was one she had passed with grace. Her thoughts turned once more to the neighbor. She knew that the experience would linger for her, a quiet lesson in humility and awareness. Sometimes people needed to confront their assumptions and biases in ways that were subtle but unforgettable. Today had provided that opportunity without conflict, without aggression, and without resentment. It was a small victory for understanding, one that was quietly powerful because it had been delivered through calm observation and self-assurance rather than confrontation. She rose from the lounger, stepping carefully onto the cool stone around the pool. The water sparkled, reflecting the changing light, and she allowed herself a brief moment to run her hands along its edge, feeling the gentle movement. It was a tactile reminder of control, of the small pleasures in life, and of the peace she had reclaimed. She was home, in her space, and no assumption or bias could change that. As the evening shadows grew longer, she began to gather her things, preparing to move indoors for the night. The tension of the afternoon had faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. She had faced scrutiny, handled it with calm authority, and maintained her peace. The lesson for herself, and quietly for others, had been delivered without a word of anger. It was a reaffirmation of self, a reminder that dignity and composure were powerful tools in any situation. Before stepping inside, she looked out across the yard one last time. The neighborhood had resumed its calm, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded. But she carried the memory with her, a reminder of resilience, patience, and the quiet strength that came from living authentically. She was a woman who knew her worth, who understood her rights, and who refused to let assumptions define her experience. With that thought, she stepped into her home, leaving the pool and the late afternoon sun behind. The house welcomed her with familiar warmth, the subtle hum of appliances and the comforting scent of home. She felt the peace she had fought to maintain settle fully around her, a quiet victory over bias, assumption, and unnecessary tension. Today had been a test, and she had passed, not with confrontation but with calm, clarity, and confidence. The evening settled over the neighborhood with a gentle calm. The sun had dipped behind the houses, casting long, soft shadows across the lawns. Birds chirped their last songs before nightfall, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming night. In her home, the woman reflected on the events of the afternoon. She had handled the situation with the neighbor and the police, but the encounter left her with more to think about than she had expected. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping a glass of water, her mind tracing back over the confrontation. On one hand, it had been minor, a brief interruption in her afternoon. On the other, it had highlighted a truth she had long known. People made assumptions too quickly, judged too harshly, and often acted without knowing the full story. It was exhausting at times, but it was also a reality she had learned to navigate with strength and grace. Her career in law enforcement had taught her the value of observation and patience. It had taught her to assess situations calmly, to keep her emotions in check, and to respond with clarity rather than impulse. That training had served her well today. She had not raised her voice, had not lashed out, and had not allowed someone else's fear or prejudice to dictate her behavior. Instead, she had maintained her calm, shown her authority quietly, and protected her peace. The neighbor's reaction also lingered in her mind. She could imagine the embarrassment, the awkwardness, and the silent acknowledgement of error. It was a moment that would stay with her, a quiet reminder of the importance of reflection. Sometimes the lessons people needed were delivered not through confrontation or anger, but through calmness, dignity, and presence. She hoped the neighbor would take that lesson to heart, even if it was uncomfortable. She leaned back in her chair and thought about the larger community. The incident might have gone unnoticed by most, but those who had witnessed it, even from a distance, would have seen a woman asserting her right to exist freely and confidently. In a way, it was a subtle but meaningful example of resilience and strength. She had not needed to raise her voice or demand attention. Her actions, her calm presence, and her authority had spoken louder than words ever could. Her thoughts then turned inward, reflecting on her own journey. She had faced bias and prejudice before, in subtle ways and in overt moments. Each experience had shaped her, teaching her how to navigate a world that often judged her without understanding. She had built her life carefully, creating spaces where she felt safe and empowered. Yet even in these spaces, she had to remain vigilant, aware that assumptions could appear at any moment, even from those who lived nearby. As she sipped her water, she considered the subtle victories of the day. She had reclaimed her space, asserted her presence, and maintained her dignity without escalating conflict. That was no small achievement. It was a reflection of her strength, her training, and her understanding of herself. These moments, though they seemed minor in the grand scheme of life, were significant. They were reminders of her ability to stand firm, to navigate difficult social dynamics, and to protect her peace without compromise. She thought about the pool and the afternoon sun. The water, the warmth, and the quiet had been hers to enjoy, and she had defended that enjoyment simply by being herself. It was a small but meaningful act of empowerment. The tension with the neighbor and the arrival of the police had tested her composure, but she had remained grounded. That was the power of experience and self-awareness. She had learned that control over one's response often mattered more than control over others' perceptions or actions. The woman also reflected on the concept of boundaries. The incident had highlighted how easily boundaries could be tested or ignored. People often assumed the right to judge or intervene without full understanding. Today had been a reminder that boundaries were not only physical, but also emotional and social. Maintaining them required vigilance, clarity, and sometimes quiet assertion. She had done all of this without aggression, demonstrating that strength could be expressed calmly with dignity and authority. As evening deepened, she prepared a simple dinner. The kitchen smelled faintly of herbs and spices, the comfort of routine contrasting with the tension of the afternoon. She moved through her tasks methodically, appreciating the small pleasures of life, cooking, tasting, and savoring the familiarity of her home. It was these everyday moments that reinforced her sense of peace and agency. Even after a disruptive event, she could return to her routines, grounding herself in what she controlled and valued most. While she ate, she thought about the broader implications of the day. The assumptions people made, the quick judgments, and the readiness to call authorities were reflections of fear, ignorance, and societal bias. It was not a personal attack, she reminded herself, but rather a systemic issue that required awareness and patience. Each encounter, however brief or minor, offered an opportunity to demonstrate calm authority and to subtly educate others about respect and boundaries. Her thoughts turned again to her own resilience. She had chosen this life, a life that demanded discipline, vigilance, and strength. Her career, her hobbies, her dedication to fitness, and her love of motorcycles had all shaped her into someone who could handle unexpected challenges with grace. The afternoon had been an unexpected test, but she had passed it with poise. That realization brought a quiet satisfaction, a reaffirmation of her abilities and her understanding of herself. After dinner, she moved to her living room, the soft light casting a warm glow across the space. She reflected on how small incidents could reveal larger truths about society, perception, and human behavior. The neighbors' assumptions had been immediate, based on appearances and fear rather than understanding. It was a reminder of the ongoing work required to navigate these dynamics, both for herself and for the broader community. She didn't dwell on anger, but she allowed herself to acknowledge the frustration and exhaustion that came from such encounters. She decided to take a moment to relax, leaning back and closing her eyes. The quiet of her home, the gentle hum of appliances, and the familiarity of her surroundings helped her recover fully. She knew that she had done everything she could to handle the situation with calm authority. She had protected her peace, maintained her dignity, and set an example of how to navigate bias without aggression. That was a victory in itself, and she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of it. Later, she stepped onto her balcony, looking out over the neighborhood as the sky turned shades of pink and purple. The air was cool, and the distant lights of houses began to glow. She reflected on the subtle power of presence. Sometimes just being calm, confident, and aware could communicate lessons more effectively than confrontation ever could. The neighbor had learned something today, whether consciously or not. The police had witnessed a demonstration of composure and authority, and she had reinforced her own sense of agency and strength. She thought about the future, about similar situations that might arise. She knew that challenges like these were not isolated. People made assumptions constantly, and bias could appear in unexpected ways. But she also knew that she was equipped to handle them. Her experience, her training, her understanding of herself, and her ability to maintain calm authority were tools she could rely on. The afternoon had been a reminder, not just of the challenges, but of the power she held in navigating them effectively. As the night deepened, she returned indoors, feeling a sense of closure. The events of the day had been challenging, but they had also reinforced important truths. Her home was her sanctuary, her presence was her power, and her calm authority could diffuse tension and teach subtle lessons without a single raised voice. She allowed herself to rest, knowing that she had acted with dignity, clarity, and patience. Before going to bed, she made a mental note of the lessons from the day. People's assumptions could never control her, nor could fear dictate her behavior. Her peace, her boundaries, and her agency were hers to protect and assert. She had demonstrated that strength could be expressed quietly, that composure could teach lessons more effectively than confrontation, and that self-awareness and confidence were invaluable tools in navigating life's complexities. She finally lay down, feeling the comfort of a day completed. The sun had set, the tension had passed, and she had reclaimed her space, her peace, and her sense of dignity. The small but meaningful victory of the afternoon was hers to carry into the future. She knew that she would continue to navigate life with the same calm authority, the same awareness of her surroundings, and the same quiet confidence that had guided her through so many challenges before. And with that thought, she drifted into sleep, the sounds of the quiet neighborhood outside lulling her into rest. The day had tested her patience, her composure, and her ability to navigate assumptions, but she had met it with grace. She had reclaimed her peace, protected her dignity, and affirmed her strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new experiences, and new moments of joy, but tonight she could rest, confident in herself and in her ability to face whatever came next. The next morning, the neighborhood was bathed in soft sunlight. Birds called out from the trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly mown grass. The quiet streets and neatly kept lawns made the area seem peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet for the woman, yesterday's events were still vivid in her mind. Even after a night of rest, she could feel the tension, the lessons, and the quiet victory she had earned. It was a reminder of the balance between calm authority and the reality of living in a world quick to judge. She stepped outside into her backyard, the air warm against her skin. The pool shimmered under the morning sun, inviting and tranquil. For a moment she allowed herself to just stand there, taking it all in. The water reflected her image back at her, a symbol of her presence, her agency, and the right to enjoy her space without fear. She had weathered yesterday's misunderstanding with composure and dignity, and this morning, the world felt calm again. The neighbor had not yet come outside. The woman assumed she was still processing, still aware of the embarrassment from yesterday. She did not feel anger or resentment, but she did feel a quiet expectation that boundaries and respect would be observed going forward. It was not a confrontation she sought, but an understanding that her space and her peace mattered. She had handled yesterday with calm, and today was simply a continuation of living authentically, without fear of judgment. As she settled on her lounger with a cup of coffee, she noticed movement down the street. Other neighbors were out walking dogs, checking mail, or chatting quietly with one another. From their distance, they could sense that something unusual had occurred the day before. Some eyes lingered, curious but cautious. She acknowledged them with a nod, a small gesture of presence showing that she was unfazed and confident. This quiet display of self-assurance carried a subtle message. Her space and life were hers to enjoy. She reflected on how community dynamics worked. People often made assumptions quickly, and misunderstandings could ripple outward, affecting how others viewed situations. Yesterday's incident was likely a small story in the neighborhood, whispered to friends or family, passed along in snippets and half-formed impressions. But she was determined not to let it define her or her day. Instead, she focused on reclaiming her space and reinforcing her calm authority, simply by existing confidently and authentically. While she sipped her coffee, the neighbor cautiously stepped outside. She lingered at a distance, perhaps uncertain whether to approach or retreat. The woman by the pool did not call out, did not wave her over, but simply observed, calm and composed. She understood that reconciliation, if it came at all, would happen on the neighbor's terms, and she had no interest in forcing the moment. Her presence alone, steady and assured, was already a subtle lesson in boundaries, dignity, and respect. The neighbor finally took a hesitant step forward. She lowered her gaze slightly, as if trying to measure the right words. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice tinged with awkwardness. It was a quiet attempt at acknowledgement, and the woman in the pool responded with a simple nod. She didn't need to press for a formal apology or lecture. The neighbor's acknowledgement, small as it was, mattered. Respect could begin with tiny gestures, and patience could allow it to grow. As the morning unfolded, the woman reflected on how much power was contained in calmness. Yesterday had been a test not only of her ability to maintain composure, but also of her influence through presence alone. She had shown that strength did not always need to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was the quiet, unwavering confidence, the ability to exist fully and assert boundaries without conflict, that left the most lasting impression. Later that day, she decided to take her motorcycle out for a ride. The hum of the engine and the wind against her face were familiar comforts, a reminder of freedom, independence, and control. Riding was more than a hobby. It was a symbol of autonomy, a space where she could experience the world on her own terms. After yesterday, she appreciated it even more. The ride allowed her to release any lingering tension, to enjoy movement and speed, and to reconnect with the part of her life that was entirely hers, untouchable by assumptions or judgments. As she returned home, the neighborhood felt different to her. It was the same streets, the same houses, but she moved through it with a renewed sense of self-assurance. She was aware of how others might perceive her, how assumptions could linger, but she had the tools to navigate it with ease. Each step she took, each moment she claimed for herself, reinforced her confidence and the quiet message that she would not be diminished by ignorance. Back in her backyard, she noticed a few neighbors quietly observing from their porches. Some had heard about the incident, others had seen the police cars arrive, and a few had whispered among themselves about what had happened. She smiled faintly, not in arrogance, but in recognition that her presence had spoken volumes. She did not need to explain herself, justify her actions, or demand attention. Her calm, confident demeanor had communicated what words alone could not. She spent the afternoon enjoying her pool, the water cool against her skin, the sun warm on her face. It was a private victory, a moment reclaimed after the intrusion of judgment and suspicion. The day had begun as ordinary, had taken a tense turn, and now returned to tranquility. She allowed herself to fully enjoy it, knowing that her ability to maintain peace and assert her right to exist was more meaningful than any recognition from others. Later, the neighbor approached once more, this time with slightly more confidence. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for yesterday," she said quietly. It was awkward but sincere. The woman by the pool acknowledged the words with a gentle nod, her expression calm and accepting. She did not lecture or scold. There was no need. The apology, though small, was a recognition of error, a subtle step toward understanding, and that was enough. Respect could begin here, even if it was tentative. The afternoon sun shifted, casting soft golden light across the backyard. She reflected on the subtle power of teaching by example. The neighbor had been reminded, without confrontation or anger, of the importance of verifying situations and respecting boundaries. The police had witnessed a demonstration of calm authority, and she herself had reinforced her own strength and dignity. It was a quiet but meaningful set of lessons, unfolding naturally and authentically. As evening approached, she decided to host a small gathering for a few friends. Not to show off or make a statement, but to enjoy human connection, laughter, and the warmth of shared moments. Life was made of these ordinary, joyful experiences, and she had fought to protect her ability to enjoy them fully. Her home, her backyard, and her pool were spaces where she could cultivate happiness, connection, and peace. Yesterday's events had been a reminder of why these moments mattered so much. Her friends arrived, greeting her warmly, and the atmosphere was filled with casual conversation, laughter, and the easy rhythm of companionship. The pool became a center of fun and relaxation, a space where joy replaced tension. The woman felt the lingering stress of the previous day dissolve in the presence of friends, their support, and the simple pleasure of living authentically. She had reclaimed her space not just physically but emotionally, reinforcing her peace and her sense of agency. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, she stepped back to watch the scene. Her friends swam and laughed, the water reflecting the colors of the sky. For a moment everything felt right, ordinary yet extraordinary in its simplicity. She thought about yesterday, the neighbor, the police, and the subtle lessons delivered without aggression. Life had a way of teaching patience, resilience, and the importance of calm authority, and she had absorbed it all with grace. Later that night, the neighborhood had quieted once more. She sat on her balcony, looking at the stars beginning to twinkle above. She thought about the future, about living freely, navigating assumptions, and maintaining dignity in the face of bias. She knew that challenges would come, as they always did, but she was equipped to handle them. Her calm confidence, her awareness, and her sense of self-worth were tools that no misunderstanding or assumption could diminish. She reflected on how her life had been shaped by experiences, by choices, and by a commitment to personal strength. Riding her motorcycle, enjoying her home, maintaining her health, and building her career.